times like these, when we lock down and trying to figure out what's going on and what we should do and what does it mean, especially what does it mean for ourselves, it really is useful to draw on our shared human experience and our shared knowledge, and of course the fact that we all are in this together. Over the last few days and weeks, like yourself, I have had all sorts of strange, occasionally wonderful, but usually crazy ideas across my various social media news feeds. And I think it's time we really need to draw on more ancient wisdom to help us understand how we deal with this tough time that we face. You know, if you watched the show last week when I spoke about what astrologers think about this time, astrologers predicted World War III for ages as happening in 2020. And many people, since I said that, have pointed out to me that it is indeed World War III, that we essentially are fighting an invisible enemy on every front. I grew up thinking that that invisible enemy in World War III would be nuclear warfare, and not that that's no longer a possibility, it's just that it's kind of besides the point. So we do face a common enemy, and just like if it were nuclear war, we'd be sheltering. So many people are having difficulty with the idea of isolating themselves and the idea of, basic lockdown for 3 weeks. The striking thing for me about the newsfeed in this times is how many people there are who think that exceptions need to be made for what their personal whims and wills are all about. I mean, I am reminded of the wars. I think of the Second World War. Many of my ancestors and my immediate ancestors lived through that, and many, many of them died through that. Sometimes I imagine what it must have been like to be in Europe during the Second World War, when people were being attacked literally from the air by bombs, when people had the very, very real threat of the Nazi SS coming to their doors and dragging them away. And so many people, including my people, the Jewish nation, had to hide and were hidden by others. And we know the story of Anne Frank, who she and her family were hidden for 2 years, unable to go out, like many, many thousands of people across Europe at the time. And they did, because they understood there was something greater going on. When the Londoners were being bombed and everyone was rushed to the subways to preserve life, I don't think there were people who said, no, I've got to walk Fido, and besides for which my jog is good for my soul. Our ever increasingly individualistic, individual everything, individual choices world has led to a perhaps unintended consequence, and that is, to me, what looks like a rise in selfishness. Mostly, of course, unintended, unwitting selfishness. But it got me to thinking about a bigger picture that the philosophers would have seen. And as you know, on this show, I'm interested in what the Stoics think about things, and especially for tonight, what the Stoics think about the common good. Is there such a thing as the common good? Do we live for ourselves, or do we live for something greater than ourselves? Because it is at this time that we are asked to think of something greater than ourselves. Not God or nature or the universe, but simply the one that is right there in front of our faces, the human race. Is this a time to think about the whole human race? Talking about himself, dealing with other people, the great Stoic philosopher, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, said this: "We were born for cooperation, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of upper and lower teeth. So to work in opposition to one another is against nature. And anger or rejection is opposition to our nature, to nature itself. That's right pretty much at the beginning of his philosophical musings. From the very outset, Marcus establishes that the human condition is essentially one of a creature of nature who is by nature cooperative or part of a much bigger species, a much bigger group, the human species, or as he calls it, the human community. He says elsewhere, let your impulse to act and your action have as the goal the service of the human community, because that for you is in conformity with your nature. So it's always been well understood that community is part of our nature. Indeed, it could be said that the reason why some people resist isolation and separation and lockdown so strongly is because we are a social species and our instinct is to be social, not to isolate, which is indeed true. But if we are creatures of nature and we have some kind of responsibility to the whole of us, not just the individual of us, well then, we need to weigh up what is my instinct to be social versus my instinct to help preserve the species, the whole human race. In a world that seems ever more selfish, it's probably justifiable to ask, do we even feel ourselves part of that human race anymore? Yes, we are more connected than people have ever been, but at the same time, anyway, without lockdowns, we're also more separate than people have ever been, because each of us is strongly focused on our own needs and our own goals and what works best for ourselves, because we have the massive amounts of choice and personalization, customization of everything to suit our individual needs and our individual tastes. And while so much of that is innocent in its intention, it certainly can be dangerous in its implications and in its outcomes. Because, to me, the evidence is that here we sit in a world in crisis, and the strong instinct of many people is not even to socialize, but to say, what about me? So we also need to get beyond the sense that we individually ourselves are the most important thing. I mean, we know, as the Stoics keep on telling us over and over again, you are going to die. Your loved ones are going to die. Carry a memento that reminds you, and look at it every day. Many Stoics today, and then carry a little medallion that says on it, remember you're going to die. And put it in your pocket, so every day you'll put your hand in your pocket and you'll feel it, and you'll remember you are going to die. In some larger picture, the extremely strong preservation of our own individual life, perhaps at the expense of what's best for the community, is a little ridiculous, because everyone is going to die anyway, which is a Stoic attitude. It doesn't mean we have to resign ourselves to, I may as well die now. It's not about that at all. But it's the understanding that at every level, as human beings, we are all in this together. We share the same earth, we share the same life, and we share the same fate. Every single one of us shares the same fate, and that is that we will die, we will leave this planet. So, getting back to our individual concerns, it does become quite apparent that maybe we are emphasizing the wrong things. That is actually quite an important basic idea in the Stoic philosophy as a whole, which a lot of it is based on this Marcus's idea, in fact his teacher's idea, that we're all very much part of this human race, which while sometimes, it's considered a little kind of cheesy or naive that each of us has a role to play in the greater picture, it doesn't really mean that each of us is special and must fulfill our role. It means that each of us has to contribute to the common good of our species. It's not that you have to have a special role, but it's that whatever you're doing, there should be some level of it, perhaps the whole goal of it, that the human being, the human species as a whole, is in some way enhanced or gains from it. Basically, nature is all about life. Nature wants everything to live. Nature makes everything to live. And for us as a species to live and thrive, we actually have to work together to achieve that, not individually. And interestingly, for our incredible fear and avoidance of death that the Stoics are constantly trying to remind us is rather absurd to fear, since it's the inevitable fate of us all, in a small way, the only way we can achieve any kind of immortality is that if we contribute something to the whole. Because if we ensure its survival, the whole goes on forever, or whenever, however long that's going to be. Whereas individually, as I've said, we certainly don't. So for all our fear of death that often leads to selfish behavior, ironically, that same behavior ends up making us lost and forgotten, not preserved and important like we'd like to feel. Perhaps the contribution to the greater is the best avenue to ensure that we ourselves thrive and we ourselves can live forever. Marcus's teacher was the former slave Epictetus. And Epictetus says, what then does the character of a citizen promise? To hold nothing as profitable to himself, to deliberate about nothing as if we were detached from the community, but to act as the hand or the foot would do if they had reason and understood the constitution of nature. For they would never put themselves in motion or desire anything other than with reference to the whole. The foot doesn't do anything without considering the other foot. And the reason why the 2 feet do something is in order for the body to walk. The feet aren't thinking about themselves and aren't doing anything in isolation. They have an extremely important role, but that role is actually not about themselves. The Stoics were great, especially Epictetus, but also Marcus, at using the body as the obvious natural metaphor for why we are not meant to do it alone. We are not creatures of isolation. That certainly at the human level, and probably at all of nature's level, nothing is really about an individual. Everything is about the collective. There is that idea that the whole is more than the individual. So nature is constantly emphasizing the whole over the significance of the individual. And one thing we know, and the Stoics are very emphatic about, is that we are creatures of nature. We look at the world that we've damaged so badly, and we say these days, in the age of the virus, we say, nature is punishing us. Nature is cracking us across the face. Nature is fixing the damage we did to her and to our earth. And while all of that is true, she does that and is able to do that because we are of nature ourselves. Because we are part of a bigger process and consciousness and mechanism, that bigger process, consciousness, mechanism is capable of self-correction. Nature is performing self-correction when things like this happen. And for a moment, think about that word self. Self is relating to nature as a self. And if self-correction involves putting the human beings in their homes and making them ill, well, we are part of that self. And once we start remembering that the whole fact of this virus is not because we are separate from nature, but it's because we are of nature, and nature is correcting itself. Well, it's that of nature that is so important, because if that is true, then it makes you realize, well, there is something I can do then. If I don't think as the individual, and I do think of myself as of nature, which would be human nature and human species, then what I can do to contribute to the whole and be of the whole. We seem to have the strong need to make our individual actions important, to be famous, to stand out from other people. But that's not really how nature does it. And it's really by acting in cooperation with others, as we've seen in the example given by Marcus Aurelius, that it's there that we achieve the goal. It's there, says Epictetus, the foot achieves its goal of walking by cooperating with the other foot and the body. So we need to get ourselves back to understanding that even our individual goals are capable of being part of something, part of a greater human race. Not something that makes me stand above the human race and say to them all, look at me. Marcus also says, every organism is fulfilled when it follows the right path for its own nature. For a rational nature, such as ours, the right path is to withhold assent to anything false or obscure in the impressions made on its mind, to direct its impulses solely to social action, to reserve its desires and aversions to what lies in our power, and to welcome all that is assigned to it by universal nature, because it is a part of universal nature, just as the nature of the leaf is a part of the plant's nature. So it's also to act in a natural way, and the natural way, which seems to be negatively expressed sometimes, times like this, in our desire to socialize, can be redirected by rational thought in the desire to preserve that society. And maybe we can reflect for ourselves, my need to go outside, my need to mix with other people, my need just to see more people and have people around me, which is so challenging at a time like this when we're asked to isolate, is actually the same impulse as my need to be a part of something greater and to be a part of a human species. And once I realize that, I can think that I do have quite an important purpose. Because that means, given that the purpose of isolation is to help preserve the species, that I can contribute to my social needs by, at this time, isolating myself. Might sound like a contradiction, but think about that again. My best need as a human being is to contribute to the species. It makes me want to go outside and play with them all. But if I understand that contributing to the species right now is isolation in order to keep them all alive, why then I can isolate myself and in that way be part of something bigger, be part of something, just like those millions of people on the beach are part of something. We can be part of something, not just part of a movement that everyone's staying in our homes, part of that time when the humans got together to help save the species. Not that we're all going to die, but that it all gets out of hand, as we know. I say this because the Stoics, Epictetus, also noted that other creatures seem to naturally work together, like ants and bees naturally work together. Because we are prejudiced by our upbringing and our social conditioning and our society, which is very individualistically based, we need a reason to work together. We are the rational creature. We need to understand the way things are. And so understanding the metaphor of the body is how they went about that, and understanding that no part of the body works individually to contribute to our health or our humanity. All the limbs work together, and human beings are like limbs of the community as well. The Stoics essentially say, if you really want to attune yourself to nature, if you want to be part of nature, as we all claim to do, when we want to go up Table Mountain or onto the beach and they don't want to let us. I want to be out there, part of nature. Well, if you want to be part of nature, why wouldn't you do what is best for the human species as a whole? That is nature's way. Nature favors the group over the individual pretty much every single time. So if we are part of nature, we should be doing the same. And indeed, our ancestors of the 20th century, who survived the harrowing drama of the Second World War, frequently managed to rise above themselves and understand that the common good is to value the group over the individual. We all know of countless stories of people who heroically sacrificed either their lives or their needs or whatever it was for something greater than themselves. So many people today think, I would never do that. Well, here's a chance, and we don't actually have to sacrifice our lives. We can be part of nature and true to our truest nature at this time by doing something in order to, as I say, save the species. And even though it might seem that being social and socializing is our nature, thinking about the common good is more so our nature, because that is the nature of nature itself. Interestingly, Epictetus, back 2,000 years ago, also faced the fact that was obviously true then, as it still is true now, that people tend to still want to act for themselves. And he says, such is the nature of the animal man. Everything he does is for himself. Why? Even the sun does everything for its own sake. And for that matter, so does Zeus himself. But when Zeus wishes to be rain-bringer and fruit-giver and father of men and of gods, you can see for yourself that he cannot achieve those works or win those appellations unless he proves himself useful to the common interest. It's the same as the sun. If the sun thinks only of itself and all I want to do is shine, that's what I do best. But in fact, the only reason the sun shines is in order to give the light and the growth and all of those qualities of sunlight to us, to the earth that grows on that. So actually, without the recipient of that sunlight, the sun's individual purpose becomes completely useless. The bottom line, according to the Stoics, is that nature and the human experience is set up in such a way that we can't actually achieve what is really good for ourselves without actually contributing to the common good. Even if what is good for you is the ego boost of fame, unless everyone else thinks you're fabulous, you're not going to get that. And people are only going to think you're fabulous if you do something which also benefits them. So Epictetus says, since we are such a rational animal, use your rational and realize that in order to do anything that's good for you, it actually has to be good for everyone else as well. Built into the very rationality of the universe is this idea that action must of necessity contribute to the good of others, which is nature's plan for our own good. And finally, our friend Marcus Aurelius reminds us what he says to himself when he gets up in the morning. He says, whenever as the sun rises you feel unwilling to get up, have this thought ready in hand. I rise to do the work of a human being. Why feel any resentment when I am rising to do that for which I was born? for which I was brought into the world? Or was I made instead just to lie under these bedclothes, all warm and comfortable? Well, it's pleasurable to do so. But were you born for pleasure? Look at it this way. Were you born for passivity or to be a person of action? Can you not see that even the shrubs, the sparrows, the ants, the spiders and the bees all do their bit, their part in making up the smooth functioning of the world? So why don't you do your bit too and perform the role of a human being? Stay safe, stay home, stay indoors, and I'll see you next time.